All right, Chantel, it's all you.
Thank you so much, Janelle, and thank you to everyone. I'm very honored to be invited into this space to be with you for the next 2 hours. I would love to invite us to start our session off in the way that we start all of our trauma of money classes, where we change our view mode to gallery, if that's possible for you. And just taking a moment to just take a look at the community here. See if you can maybe make eye contact with someone. I don't know if that will feel possible, but just taking a moment, going through the screens, and just taking some time to connect. And if you don't have the video on, that's okay. Just connect with your name in that little, in the Zoom over here. Amazing. One of the most regulated states of the nervous system, which we're going to talk about today, has a nickname, and the nickname is safe and social. So it's called ventral vagal, and they call it safe and social. So I really love to start out the spaces getting into that space of safe and social. So I will invite you on that note to make that your priority today, safety. We're going to be talking about something that can bring up a lot. So your number one priority is to make sure that you feel safe and you feel supported. Your nervous system feels supported. So whatever you need to do to make that happen, I encourage you to do it. My name is Chantel Chapman. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm tuning in. I live and I work on the stolen traditional territory of the Musqueam, Kwantlen, and Tsawwassen people, which is also known as Richmond, BC. So it's about 30 minutes outside of Vancouver, BC in Canada. And I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're just going to, if I could get co-host, that would be amazing. Thank you. Okay. Oh, I'm on the wrong page to start. Okay, here we go. Okay, so everyone can see my screen? Yeah? Good. Okay. So I'd love to just start out by talking a bit about commitment for the container today. And this is the group pledge that we use in the Trauma of Money program. And I would love to read it to you and just make sure we all feel safe and on the same page with this. So as a group, we can collectively uphold the safety of this container. I understand that the Trauma of Money method works at a deep emotional level, and myself and my fellow students may decide to share personal information. At all times, I have the right to decide the degree of my sharing and to ask for further explanation or support. In this training, I may be asked to explore emotions, beliefs, behaviors, which could result in a new level of awareness that takes me outside of my comfort zone. Part of this work may feel uncomfortable. This training is not a substitute for mental health care or medical care. At any time, if you feel emotionally triggered to the point where it feels out of your control, please seek help in the need of a professional therapist, mental health support, or contact me, and I can put you in touch with resources available. I also understand that Trauma of Money method is not providing investment advice. And I understand that as a group, we are committed to eliminating racism and any other forms of discrimination and harassment, and racism and discrimination of any type will not be tolerated. I agree to the following. I will hold strict confidentiality regarding all matters, names, events pertaining to the sharing of any participants in the group. I will not disclose information about another group member outside of the group verbally or through written or electronic means, including email, Instagram, Facebook, etc., unless I have consent. So I'm not really talking about like sharing some of the stuff you learned in here. You're more than welcome to take pictures of our slides you're more than welcome to share that. I'm talking more specifically when we move into personal sharing. If anyone talks about their experiences, that we just respect that with confidentiality within the space. And an important element of the trauma of money method is embodiment of the theory and bringing it into practice. So active participation will enable you to do this. And I understand I get out what I put in. So I just want to take a moment to just see if that feels safe to you, if that feels good, if anyone has any concerns or we're feeling good. Great. Amazing. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go back to my screen sharing. I want to tell you a couple more things about this space. Trauma of money really works at its most simplest level to decrease shame and increase discernment. And one of the ways that we can really do that is through hearing from multiple voices. So this is an invitation to interrupt me, to write your feelings or thoughts in the chat, and to share questions or experiences or anything as we go. I would love this experience to be more of a co-collaboration versus me just kind of talking at you, because I find that with a lot of financial education, it's set up in that way where there's like an expert and it creates this hierarchy, and that whole experience actually can lead to feelings of shame. So we really want to minimize the feelings of shame, which will allow us to increase discernment. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about shame. Obviously, you probably know the shame queen, Brené Brown, and she says that most of us carry shame. And carrying shame is a good thing because it actually shows empathy. And we're going to talk a little bit about the power of shame and the power of guilt as we go along our journey together. So shame being a signal of empathy is a good thing to have. But she also talks about the difference of shame versus guilt. And Brené Brown says that shame essentially becomes a bit of an identity. So it would look like, I have a credit card debt, therefore I'm bad with money all around. And it becomes like this blanket statement versus feeling guilt about an isolated experience. Now, shame is a really powerful experience and feeling because it can make us feel the terror of abandonment. So shame versus guilt. I'm bad versus the action was bad. Experientially, though, shame and guilt can feel really similar. So terror of abandonment, shunned, being cast out. Intellectually, though, we can separate the difference between shame and guilt. Now, I love this quote from Dr. Anna Lemke, which is a researcher on dopamine. And I know the Holisticism community researches dopamine quite a bit. So you'll probably appreciate this too. Mutual honesty precludes shame and results in a greater sense of intimacy, connection, and safety. We are accepted despite our flaws. And I just noticed I have a spelling mistake, which you may see a lot because I do that often in my presentations. But this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that safe and social state of the nervous system, which is quite regulated. So we can actually use shame as a way to get to that safe and social state of the nervous system. However, shame also can take us completely out of that state. And when we approach shame in the destructive way, the researchers call it the destructive shame cycle. This is how it looks. There may be a behavior or a thought or a belief. We feel shamed. We feel like we'll be shunned, and then we'll need to soothe that pain. It's really painful. And so the need to soothe pain might result in a behavior that causes more shame. So if we put this through the lens of money, it could look like this. I'm really shitty with money, and then I shun myself, or I feel like that other people, family and friends, will judge me. And then I feel pain and I need to soothe that pain. So I'm going to try to access a behavior that might increase my dopamine and might increase my pleasure, like maybe overspending, And then I feel bad about the overspending, and it just puts us in this cycle. Now, how can we use shame in a way to regulate the nervous system? This is the framework that we use in the Trauma of Money around shame, and we use it in a group, and it's very powerful in a group when we're working with money, is we take our shame and we apply radical honesty to it. So we're honest about the shame that we feel. We're honest with ourselves about what's arising, the narrative around the shame. And we either meet ourselves or we meet the group, whoever is sharing, with empathy and acceptance. And once yourself or the person sharing feels like they're accepted in their radical honesty, they're actually able to take course redirect and do something different if they are in the power of adjusting their behavior or making a change, if that's in their power for what they feel shame about. And then from that standpoint, we experience belonging and connection. So this is the opposite of that, oh no, I feel like I'm going to be abandoned. And another quote from Dr. Anna Lemke, it is not our perfection, but our willingness to work together to remedy our mistakes that creates the intimacy we crave. This intimacy can result in a healthy rush of dopamine versus dopamine from cheap pleasures. This rush is adaptive, rejuvenating, and health promoting. So I always love to start every single conversation around money by just talking about shame and just identifying the reality that many of us carry a lot of shame, and we can actually use it to help us connect and help regulate the nervous system so we can look at things through a different lens. So I'm just going to take a break and take a look at the chat. Wonderful. So friends, I want to move into some sharing and ask you this question. What is my core belief about myself and money? And I'd really like us to focus on maybe some unhelpful beliefs if possible. And I'm going to share with you a link to a Miro board, and we can all write anonymously our unhelpful money narratives. I'm going to put this in the chat. Wonderful. So I'll also share my screen and show you how this works if you've never been on Miro board before. Okay, so here is our Miro board. You can actually make it bigger by zooming in and out. And on the left-hand side, we're going to write down some of our unhelpful narratives. So you're going to double-click on the Post-it and type, and then drag it into the left. And there's layers of Post-its there. So feel free to write multiple narratives if you'd like. This is anonymous unless you do have an account with Miraboard and you put your name on there. But it looks like most of us here are showing up anonymous. Wonderful. So we'll just take a moment to write down maybe some unhelpful money narratives that we might have. Easy in, easy out. Wanting to make a lot more money makes me a bad person. Oh, relatable, yes. I am bad at math, therefore I'm bad at money. Wow, yes. To be worthy of my income, I need to be perfect. It's hard to make money. I'm shitty with money. Money doesn't know its way to me. I spend so much money that I can't be trusted to have it. I have to work hard. There isn't enough. People can't afford to pay me. I feel like I need to work full-time hours to get out of debt. Being in debt is bad. I have a threshold of how much I can earn. If I make a lot of money, people will judge me. And if you could try to move your Post-it to the left side of the board, if you've got something in our helpful money narrative section, because we want to keep that section clear. Yeah. And you can be outside of the board, but just try to stay to the left-hand side there. We can move some of these Post-its. There we go. Thank you, friends. Money isn't safe to hold. Men will always earn more than me. I feel better about myself when I have money, but I shouldn't. Beautiful. So I want to ask if anyone wants to share with their voice about their money narrative. What's present for you right now? What's coming up?
I'll share. I definitely have a connection to perfectionism and income. That if I'm getting paid for something, I have to be an expert, I have to be perfect, and I have to have all the answers, or I'm not deserving of my income.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Do you know when that narrative comes up, when you first ever felt that? Can you remember back to the first time you've ever really felt that thought?
Yeah, I think definitely looking at one of my first jobs, the saying was like, if you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean. Like we're paying you, you're on the clock. If your station, if everything isn't perfect, then why are you here?
Yeah. 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 I heard that line too. If you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very relatable. Anyone else?
I think one for me is that I kind of have always kept in the back of my mind, like, I'm never going to be able to make enough money. I'm always going to have to work multiple jobs. I'm always going to have to do multiple things, or I won't be able to make enough.
Yeah. Thank you, Angelica. What about you? Have you thought about the first time you've experienced that thought?
I honestly would say I've been working since I was 15. I honestly have to trace it back to even then, being like a 15, 16-year-old, kind of paying your own gas in your car and for you to eat lunch at school and just being like, there's never enough. So I'm going to have to go work another job, or I need to pull a double this weekend to make sure I have enough or get enough or get more, because then it's going to just be gone by tomorrow. And kind of just that scarcity mindset, very much so.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Anyone else like to share?
Hi.
Hello.
I feel like I grew up in a very impoverished family. Like I used to get food from the school. Like Angelica, I've also been working since I was 14, 15. So I feel like I have a problem with that scarcity mindset. Like, oh, I have money. Like I'm not supposed to have money, so why don't I spend it to make it go away? And as an artist, I always feel like I have to price my art very low, otherwise people won't buy it. Because every time I increase the price, I notice people don't buy it, and then when I lower it, they do, and I'm like, oh, maybe I just have to keep doing this, and it kind of circles back to that kind of scarcity and not worthy mindset of oh, if I value this more, people aren't going to want it, so I might as well just keep it low so that other people that maybe don't have a lot of money can get it. But then it ends up putting me, it sets me back, because then I'm undervaluing my art and putting my business in the negatives.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you, Sammy. Thank you so much for sharing that. Laura.
Hi. So I guess I grew up in a household where both of my parents worked, but there was always disparities between my parents because my mom made less money and there was always conflict. And now being married myself, I put this pressure on myself to make at least as much as my partner to show up in the relationship 50-50, even though, I mean, that's not always attainable and it doesn't always make sense. But I feel like I have to attain that. Otherwise, there's going to be conflict like my parents had. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Really a lot of wisdom in that share there. Thank you so much. Tanya?
Yeah, so just to kind of piggyback on a couple of the girls, I also grew up with that scarcity mindset and the lack mentality. And like you have to work really, really hard to make money and to keep it. But then also, now that I am making money, I feel like I'm not supposed to rest because I have to work really, really hard. So I feel really guilty when I have time to rest. So that also goes hand in hand with money. Like I should be making more. I should be doing more things. And so it's just a bunch of convoluted stuff.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Alexandra.
Hi. I would say my main one is that you have to work like insanely hard and be insanely smart to make a lot of money, and that like only really, really like cream of the crop, intelligent and hard workers make a lot of money. When like more and more I'm realizing like that's not true. Like a lot of the people that make the most money I know like do not work the hardest and are not necessarily the most intelligent in the room. But really I think where this came from for me is like my parents both grew up really poor, but then they both made a lot of money. But they were like working 100-hour weeks, like getting, got like perfect college grades, everything to achieve that. And there was always this messaging from them that like, well, this person that you see that's like a millionaire, billionaire, it's because they're really smart and like they work really hard. And if you want that, you need to like study hard and work hard and be smart always. And I'm letting go of that now, that I don't think I have to work hard to make a lot of money.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's very relatable, those narratives. Christine.
Hello. Yes, I echo everything all of the ladies said previously. Just the feelings of working really, really hard in order to deserve money and wealth and abundance, and also feelings of feeling so blessed to be in the situation I am now, and knowing that other people aren't. So I should be just so happy and just so blessed that I have what I have, and I'm good. I don't need to receive more abundance. I think that comes from, me being first generation American, and seeing my community be, just in a hard place. And I just have so much, and I'm like, I don't need much, but I can give away much. So the Shadow Work Challenge has really been helpful for me and give some insights. But yeah, just the unworthiness and having to work really, really hard, and all of that.
Thank you, Christine. That's really beautiful. And I love how you brought up that we can hold multiple views at the same time, especially when it comes to money. So that's a really important point. Jen.
Yes, thank you. And I will echo that, many of the comments I was resonating with. And I raised my hand because I think a lot of my journey, I actually had like a fairly privileged upbringing, but it was because my family worked in corporate America. And so the only way to make money in our world is if you're in corporate America, or if you're in like, to be in a healing or arts or in any other sort of business venture is not necessarily going to be the sustainable, strong, where you make money. And then I think simultaneously, because I went into education initially, it's that idea of like budgets are tight. Like there's a lot of like pressure around frugality and like making sure that you do everything on, on a dime, or like make sure that you're like penny pinching, if you will. Those are like the mindsets that I think got entrenched, and I'm really like removing those, and this, this work around understanding like how did a system get embodied in myself, from like a monetary vantage point, when I don't ever think I had that. I've had like a belief system of abundance, but it's like I feel like I've disconnected from that in order to work in a system for as long as I did.
Yeah. Wow. Powerful, Jen. Thank you so much. Lots of wisdom there. Kayla.
I feel like from a young age, it was kind of a joke in my family that I always wanted to spend too much money, or that I spent too much money. And now I just have this overwhelming feeling that like I can't be trusted to have money because I don't know the right way to spend it. Like I spend too much. It's just this very overwhelming feeling that is like, I spend too much money. I should not have money because I am not going to be smart with it. And there's just a lot of anxiety around that.
Yeah, I hear that. Thank you, Kayla. Thank you so much. We're gonna have some shares up until Claire, and then we'll have more sharing time a little bit later. And Joanna, you are next.
I want to add, I resonated with a lot of what other people have said before. What also comes up for me is this belief that when you have money, you're a really bad person. Like you're an asshole and nobody will love me anymore if I have money, plus my family will, exile me, because that's just not a thing that we do. We like the scarcity narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Joanna. Good points. Lee.
Hello. Yeah, a lot of what has been shared already I resonate with, but also like Jen had shared, I also grew up quite privileged as an Indigenous woman, only because my dad made a choice to focus on the mainstream instead of living off the land like his parents did. And then there's this narrative of, well, if I'm making money, then like I should be grateful for the money that I'm making, and I can't have more because there's so many people struggling to have their basic needs met. So that's kind of like the duality that I struggle with.
Yeah. I hear that, Lee. Thank you so much. Claire.
I just noticed a narrative that I didn't realize I had about like, if I stay below the poverty line, then when I die and go to the good place and they look at all the nonsensical things I've contributed to in my life, I'll be able to be like, look, the government gave me money. I didn't support my country's military. I also didn't contribute to social programs because I couldn't, but just like taking just clocking my activism as a form of like passive inaction. I have no impact, and that makes me better than trying. So I just didn't notice that, and I wanted to share just because I was like, the tax bracket thing really gets me, like what I will be responsible for when I pay in to where I am. That's my story.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. I love that, Claire. Thank you so much. Okay, friends. I'm wondering if we can just take a moment to take an inventory on our nervous system and our body, and just notice how it felt to go into those narratives. And then also notice how it felt to hear others. Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. And maybe if it feels accessible to you and safe to you, I invite you to take a breath in through the nose and an extended exhale. And if that felt nourishing, I invite you to do it again. just witnessing our experience and the way it's feeling in the body. Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Yeah, lots coming up. Okay. And just so you know, you may hear my dog snoring in the background. They are the nervous system co-regulators that I invited into the space to snore and create a pacing of rest. All right, friends. So we talked a little bit about some core beliefs that come up for us. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of the sources of those beliefs, some of the sources of those narratives. I was resonating a lot with many of the shares that I heard about holding multiple different beliefs. And also I think about my own experience with money, and it's one of the reasons why I do the work that I do. I grew up in poverty with a single mother, and we lived in social housing. And I grew up around crime and addiction, and there was a lot of chaos and a lot of trauma. And I developed certain narratives about money through that experience that really kind of laid the foundation and the path for my life and my career and some of the choices that I made. And I noticed myself having a bit of what Dr. Brad and Ted Klons, who are financial psychologists, would call money worshiping disorders, where a lot of the actions I was taking were all about being around money. But the interesting thing is, when I created wealth for myself, I couldn't really hold on to it. I would overspend and rack up debt. And it was even hard to create wealth for myself because I was under earning quite a bit and really staying in a low income range. And while I was also a workaholic. So a lot of my experiences growing up formed my path of working in finance and educating around financial literacy. And it also informed certain behaviors, like what type of people I hung out with. I was kind of obsessed with hanging out with like wealthy, successful, established people for a while. And I learned that was a very illuminating experience, and I learned a lot. But as I came back to myself, I started to ask these deep questions, like so here I am teaching financial literacy. I'm working in finance, but I have some very interesting behaviors around money. What actually impacts people's relationship with money, or my relationship with money? And I kind of went back through my life, and I did a bit of a timeline of my life and started mapping them with some of my behaviors around money. And that experience, through my lens, but through the lens of looking at poverty and the wealth gap and things at a larger level, this model was birthed. And this is the framework which we teach from in the Trauma of Money. And we believe that these 6 layers impact our relationship with money. And I'm just going to actually ask Joanna if you have a question before I go forward, because I just see your hand there.
Oh, so sorry. I forgot to put it down.
Oh, that's okay. No problem. Okay. So the first layer is generational trauma or intergenerational trauma. So understanding that our ancestral lineage has been through experiences which could have resulted in trauma. And this can show up when we're interacting with money. The next layer is relational trauma. So this is trauma that we have experienced within our lifetimes, between us and someone else or another entity. So a lot of our childhood experiences might fall under relational trauma if they caused us to feel unsafe or unworthy. Societal trauma is another layer that heavily impacts our relationship with money. And under societal trauma, we would put things like consumerism. So one of the main narratives of consumerism is that if you ever feel pain, boredom, inadequacy, anything but excited or happy, there's something wrong and we need to fix it immediately. And consumerism will position purchasing products or services or experiences as the solution. So consumerism has a very deep relationship with actually dopamine. And so this can result in societal trauma, it can result in consumerism, and it can push the narrative of scarcity, which we're going to talk about today as well. Another example of societal trauma is capitalism. So just the way capitalism exists, the exploitation that exists within capitalism, and all the pain that is associated with capitalism clearly can impact our relationship with money. We actually believe in the trauma of money that sometimes when people do emotional healing work around their relationship with money, they will hit a block because a lot of the work that they do is focused on the individual, but so much of our pain around money is directly linked to societal and collective trauma. And so if you don't address the collective trauma, you're leaving out this massive piece of the puzzle in regards to your healing. Another example of societal trauma is colonialism as well. And then the next layer is systemic trauma, and understanding that there are certain systems that exist, especially in the world of finance, that elevate some and marginalize many others. The next layer we call laws of nature, and the name is to represent that there are multiple worldviews around money that exist outside of maybe the dominant culture's worldviews around money that actually can impact our relationship with money in a good way, like reciprocity. So reciprocity is a law of nature that thrives in nature. And we also know that reciprocity doesn't really exist so much in exploitive capitalism. So, for example, in exploitive capitalism, we see folks that take, and then there are some of us that feel a major sense of injustice for all this taking. So our response or our reaction is to be on the other opposite end of the scale and give. And that guilt that we feel, and that injustice that we feel leads to us giving to the point where our lives or whatever we're doing is not sustainable, and we end up actually exploiting ourselves. So I see this a lot with entrepreneurs who work in social ventures, entrepreneurs who work in the healing spaces where they're undercharging, they're under earning, they're giving away things for free. And one of the reasons why they're doing this is because they are carrying the narrative of the collective trauma, societal trauma, and they're feeling that guilt and aversion to capitalism. So exploring multiple narratives around money and good narratives and good worldviews that maybe even come from our ancestral lineage that are different from dominant culture's worldview around money. So really, this is where we get to define like what wealth actually means to us and create a financial plan based on that versus what has been sold to us by, dominant culture. And then the last layer is financial literacy. And the last layer being financial literacy is on purpose because we know that when we're in a trauma-triggered state or when we're in a state of scarcity, it's very challenging to engage with financial literacy education. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that is. And I'll just take a look at the chat. Okay. Great. If you have a question that feels really important that you want to ask, please interrupt me or raise your hand because I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything here. So I showed you that map, the model of trauma of money, and we want to now link it to that question or that unhelpful narrative that we were starting the class with. So we take that unhelpful narrative and then we apply this multi-layered lens of all the sources of where this narrative came from. And then we ask this very important question: whose shame is this? Whose shame is this? And we go into that narrative and we say, the first question is, when have I first felt this way? And so going through the motions of thinking about the first time you've experienced those feelings, a lot of the feelings that we have around money might be linked to how we grew up in our home with our family of origin, but also going into those other layers that we mentioned. So like, what have you learned from society, and how are the societal influences showing up in that narrative? And one thing that's really important on this path of discovery and recovery here is the understanding that we can hold multiple beliefs and narratives at the same time. So one thing that I see people do sometimes is they want to try to pinpoint like the exact experience that caused the trauma, that caused the belief. And the thing is it's not always that simple, because there might be a societal narrative that actually influenced the trauma influence relational trauma. And then the societal narrative continues on. So focusing on the source of it, if it was a childhood trauma, is not always helpful if it's continuously happening in society because of like maybe capitalism or colonialism. So really just understanding that we can hold these multiple beliefs at the same time is important in this healing journey. Yeah, my body feels like my body shuts down when someone tries to teach or even talk to me about money. Not right now though. Okay, I'm good. I'm glad to hear that, Lexi. And that's a really common reaction that you're describing, is when someone starts talking about money, it can cause the shutdown in the body. So I'm really happy that we're referencing how the body feels, because that's a really important part of this work. So would anyone like to share anything that's present for them right now when we're talking about these layers, when we're asking the question, whose shame is this? Would anyone like to share? Kayla.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot coming up with the whose shame is this. My parents, they've like fought about and struggled with money for the majority of the time I've been alive. And I'm on track to be a therapist and to earn like a good income. And I just have this feeling that if I'm making more money than them by my mid-20s, while they've spent my entire waking life fighting about money, and I'm living a happy and comfortable life, like, excuse my language, but I feel like that makes me almost kind of an asshole. Like, they fought so hard, and I'm just over here reaping the benefits. Yeah.
Thanks, Kayla. Yeah. Thank you. That's real. That's a real belief to have, and that can cause quite a bit of pain, and that can result in potentially some behaviors that may impact your ability to create wealth if you're feeling that consciously or subconsciously. And so I'm really grateful to be able to witness you identifying that and sharing it to the group to be witnessed in this way. Yannick.
Hi, I want to say thank you so much. I feel so much going on physically and emotionally, and it does feel really healing. And I think for me, the narrative was around the confusion, and then seeing that map and seeing the generational confusion due to mental illnesses and all other sorts of traumas, and how it feeds into that narrative as well, and kind of keeps it alive physically too. So even being able to see it in this way where it's not put on me, because we ask that question, whose is it? It's like, it's this thing that happens, in this larger system that we're all in. So just to like sit with the truth of that and let it be.
So beautifully said. Thank you so much for articulating that in that way so perfectly, because that's what we're trying to do in this work here. And we try to separate the narratives from our own innate worthy selves and remind ourselves that a lot of these narratives are not who we are. So it's not our shame. They were placed upon us. So how can we create room between the innate worthy self that we are and the narrative that is showing up in our presence? And in that space is where we get to choose a different path forward. Bianca.
Hello. So what's coming up for me is a lot of shame around asking for help, and what I'm realizing that it's coming from my mom and being a single mom, and really she just never asked for help. And I'm kind of in the same situation now where I'm a single mom and in a very difficult situation, but I need help. And realizing how hard that has been, it's almost traumatizing to ask. But yeah, I'm working on it.
It's a beautiful awareness, Bianca, and I'm so grateful that you shared it to be witnessed with this entire group here, because it's very vulnerable to say that you need help, especially when we're living under some of the tenets of white supremacy. There's an amazing list, the tenets of white supremacy, and one of them is individualism, and like asking for help and relying on the community is not something that capitalism and dominant culture really teaches a lot. Yet when we talk about our nervous system, the most regulated place is nicknamed safe and social, which to me, when I hear that, I'm like, community, help, support, so it's beautiful to hear you share that and remind all of us the importance of asking for help and not taking on all the responsibility when we don't always need to.
Yeah, thanks. I love that.
Thank you, Bianca. Georgia.
Yeah, it's interesting that I noticed with my family, we lived on a farm and we had to sort of always be prepared for drought and sort of the worst case situation. And then as I've grown up, I've realized that I just don't spend money. It just sits in my savings. I don't touch it. And when I feel like I want to touch it, I'm like, oh God, that's so selfish. Like, what if my house burns down tomorrow? Like, just this constant fear of an emergency coming up and not having the funds.
Yeah, beautiful, Georgia. Thank you so much. Sometimes when we think about our relationship with money, and good or bad money habits, we hear so much about overspending and debt and overspending, but there is also another behavior around money, which is underspending, where we're really grasping, and that comes from fear of the future because of maybe a really strong past negative orientation. And this is where scarcity comes into play. One of the things that we explore deep in the trauma of money is our relationship with time. So are we leaning into a past negative orientation, or are we more future oriented where we're really afraid of the future? Are we really hopeful about the future? And the way we sit in time and the way we interact with time is really illuminating on our relationship with money. And I know our teacher on time, Maceo Paisley, is a friend of your community as well, teaches that. So thank you, Georgia, for bringing that up. Any other thoughts?
I'll just jump in really quickly and all I keep thinking about are just like the layers. And part of it is a little overwhelming because it's like, oh wow, there's actually so much to unpack when I was looking at the wheel that was created. And in thinking about, I also, a lot of people that are sharing that they grew up kind of watching their parents struggle for money or fight over money. And that was like a big part of my parents' divorce. And so not only that, but growing up, there was always a narrative of like being a Black woman, I have to work like twice as hard, if not like even harder than anyone else in the space. And I don't like working hard. Like, I don't like working. So it always felt so counterintuitive and like so against like my natural state of being. So I have a lot of anxiety over that. And then my dad is like has worked really, really hard to support an entire family, whereas my mom is like basically poverty level. And like, so there's so like these dynamics that I'm kind of constantly taking in and feeling like I have to kind of go one way or the other. And the feeling of like not being able to get ahead, like always having some responsibility, even if I do have a lot of money. My dad's been able to make, a great life for himself, but he also has so much responsibility that it's almost like it's constantly going out. So there's never like enough to feel wealthy. Or I'm going to be like, my mom and like not have any money and have like spent my whole life being dependent. And, there's just so many like narratives that I have sort of floating around in my head and like, where do I start? Like what layer do I pull off first?
Yes, I hear you, Janelle, and I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that, your experience and the question of where do you start, because the layers can feel endless. And the one thing I will tell you is the work is not necessarily to clearly map the source of every layer, but to know that it comes from multiple places. It's kind of like, one of my friends is going through a breakup right now, and she was like, why did he do this? I don't understand why he did this. And I was like, look, if you are trying to like understand this other person and why they did this, you're going to sit in suffering so much. Like, it's just like they did that. Can you just know that they just did that because they've got some other stuff going on and that's it, instead of trying to like pull it apart and analyze why and exactly how and like pinpoint where it came from. It's more about just like having the mindfulness, like, oh, it's from here, it's from here, it's from here. And I get that. And could be from other places I will have not even discovered, and maybe I'll discover later. That is mostly the helpful experience. And I'll show you why we have a diagram that explains that. Where is that? Here it is. Okay. So this is the trauma of money method. This is like our approach to interacting with our money. I'm showing you the entrepreneurial finance plan because I know a lot of you have your own businesses in this space, but it's very similar for the personal finance plan as well. But we use these 6 steps when interacting with our relationship with money. And this is actually going through a redesign because I think it should be circular, and I'll explain why. But here it is right now, work in progress. So phase 1, we call the window of resilience or the window of regulation phase. And this is all about regulating our nervous system. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more next. And this is also where we ask, like, we identify the narrative and we ask where it came from. And it's as simple as being like, oh, the narrative is this. And I think it's from, it can be like, I think it's from dominant culture. I think it's from colonialism. I think it's from my parents and I grew up with, but the main focus is regulating the nervous system. And one of the ways we can do that is through challenging the belief and being like, oh, I'm not this narrative, because that really disempowers this shame. And then phase 2 is where once our nervous system is feeling more regulated, we move into this phase of visioning. And this is where we disempower the narratives that are unhelpful and we empower the helpful narratives. And this is really using the framework of narrative therapy approaches. And narrative therapy approaches say that we can hold multiple narratives at the same time, and we actually have the ability to empower other narratives if that feels helpful for us. So in the vision phase, this is where we get to explore things like, how would we reimagine capitalism? here I am, an entrepreneur, and I have an aversion to exploitive capitalism. How do I make wealth in my business and not be exploitive or not act like some asshole billionaire, right? And so we find that space where we can do that, and we're minimizing the guilt around creating wealth, because that is a big block. The aversion to capitalism is a big block for a lot of the folks that we work with. And so reimagining how we can actually use our business and we can create wealth in a way where it's a good thing and we're doing good with it. We use in our program, we use a journal called Money as Medicine. And I think that's such a beautiful reframe. And that was written by Edgar Villanueva, who wrote Decolonizing Wealth. And I love how he reframes like money can be used for good. And so this is where we get to really vision that and what that is like for us to have wealth, to hold wealth and use it for good. And then after we've done some visioning, we go into more of an inventory phase. So when we're feeling very supported and clear in our vision, that's the place where we start our financial literacy path. And that's where we go into like inventory. So inventory can be things like, how much money am I spending every month? Do I have debt? How much money do I owe people? How much money do I think I'm going to make? Like, can I do some projections on my business? Inventory can also be inventory on goals. It can also be inventory on feelings and emotions. So if anyone is familiar with the 12-step recovery program, they do a lot of inventory. They talk about taking a daily moral inventory. Or if you're in a situation of conflict, they have this thing, step 10, where you identify, you do some writing on like what is your inventory? Like, how are you showing up in this experience? And then phase 4 is very, very important. And this is the harmonizing phase. And one of my students in my last cohort said something so beautiful. They said, in this phase, can I add my grief? And this can be a phase where you sit and experience some of your grief from maybe some of the narratives that you've been carrying for so long. Or this is the phase where we forgive ourselves for what we did to survive. So if you're an overspender or you have debt, after you do that inventory and see that, it's very important to take time to forgive yourself and to come into harmony with yourself and your own innate worthiness. And then phase 5, we call resilient action. So this is really where we get into our action. This is the financial literacy. This is the budgeting. This is the investing. And then after that is refinement. And this is understanding that our money, our relationship with money, our financial projections, our budget is always in a state of refinement. And this phase is so important, especially if you're working with scarcity beliefs, because with scarcity, we need to introduce something called fault tolerance, which I'm going to talk about. And fault tolerance happens when we see life through the lens of being in a state of refinement. So if you know anything about like the lean startup method for launching businesses, they talk about like having an agile launch where you come up with an MVP, a minimum viable product, you launch it, and you're just constantly refining after you gain feedback. Like you create small feedback loops and you refine. And that's a really cool way to look at your relationship with money as well. And that's why I think this should be circular, because we always are kind of going through this with the refinement. All right. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about that window of resilience. Okay, so we're talking a lot about trauma. It's a big word, and I think it's important to really define what we mean here by trauma. Now, this is one of our trauma teachers. We have quite a few in our trauma money method, and this is Andrea. She's known on Instagram as a somatic witch, and she's amazing. And Andrea talks about trauma like this. She says trauma can be a single incident, experience like a car accident, hurricane, fire, even a bad fall down the stairs. It can be ongoing, like living in a police state as a person of color, being in an abusive relationship, living with a chronic illness. It can be inherited, like coming from a traumatized lineage of people who have been persecuted, enslaved, or colonized. And from our time in the womb, as epigenetics teaches us, from childhood due to an unsafe home or not feeling like we are loved or accepted. So a lot of the researchers around trauma say that trauma can be anything that happens to us that impacts the way our nervous system reacts, that leads to us feeling unsafe or unworthy. And that experience is essentially stamped in the brain. And when we encounter a similar experience, we go into a trauma-triggered state. And that trauma-triggered state is this. So in a trauma state, every response is an action in survival instead of a cognitive choice. Now, Andrea, our amazing teacher, has this little trick when she teaches trauma to kids where she explains it like this. So if you put your hand up and you make a fist, and this is your brain, and she says, okay, when we're feeling regulated, we've got our whole brain. But when we're in a trauma triggered state, we flip our lid. And we flip our lid. This means we lose access to the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex. And so when we get in a trauma triggered state, they say the prefrontal cortex goes offline. And we move into the emotional brain, the survival brain. This is where the amygdala sits, and the amygdala is basically searching the environment, looking for danger, and then it signals to the brainstem danger, and then the body reacts. So this is where we feel tightness in our chest. Maybe we feel tightness in our throat. The temperature rises. We start to sweat. Maybe we feel nauseous. Oftentimes they say feeling nauseous is really linked to freeze or like a collapse. And then in the chest and the anxiety is more like fight or flight. So the brainstem signaling to the body. So this is really good for us to know, because in somatic trauma therapy, we actually have learned that we can use the body to help signal back to the brain that we're safe. And this is what we do when we're accessing our window of regulation or window of resilience. So we know a couple reactions when we're in a trauma-triggered state. We know fight, flight, or freeze. There's another reaction that we're hearing a lot about lately, which is called fawning. And this is essentially when we people please as a trauma response. And when I found out that people pleasing was a trauma response, it gave me so much like awareness of some of my behaviors around money. Because a lot of things I was doing is I was undercharging. I was basically buying things for people all the time. I was spending money on the way that I looked, the car that I drove, all this stuff. So I felt like people were pleased with me. And my workaholism was not because I'm like, I need to create as much money as possible. I was a workaholic because I was trying to please my boss, because my boss represented a little bit of an abusive male figure who was similar to what I grew up with. And I'm trying to repair that like trauma. And I'm people pleasing. I'm having a trauma response just by working with this type of person. And so this like fawning was like, wow, this is unbelievable that so many of my interactions with money, the way I was running my business, undercharging, under earning, was related to a trauma response. Let's just take a breath. So this is a tool that we love to talk about in the trauma of money, and it was adapted from a psychologist named Dan Siegel, and he calls this the window of tolerance. But we just didn't love the word tolerate, so we changed the name we adopted the name, and we call it the window of resilience or the window of regulation. And then one of my students in the last cohort flagged to me that regulation, when it comes to the nervous system, doesn't sound good because like it reminds them of like systemic power, like regulators, regulated. And I'm like, oh, that's such a good point. So that's why I always say like window of regulation, window of resilience. You can call it whatever you want. And what they say is they use this framework to help us identify the state of our nervous system very quickly. So they say that our nervous system is on a scale from 1 to 10, and 1 to 3 is like too little arousal, which might feel like freeze or collapse. And then 8 to 10 is hyperarousal. So maybe fight or flight is in here, or maybe active fawning is in here. And then 4 to 7 is the window. So this is like the eye of the storm. And I'm just seeing the Warren G comments in here. And that's so funny because every time I say window of regulation, I think of that song too. Regulators. I can't sing for you. That'd be really embarrassing. But you'd all laugh and we'd all feel more regulated. So maybe I should mount up. Oh, that's so good. So the 4 to 7 is like the eye of the storm. So that's the optimal state of arousal where we can function with effectiveness under stress, but we're feeling regulated. So this doesn't mean that we're taking the stress and getting rid of it completely. It's like we're finding the most regulated state of our nervous system in a situation that feels harmful to us or unsafe in order to help us get to a place that is safe. So there are many ways that we can do this, and I'm going to share some. One of them is by laughing. Stacy, that was a good belly laugh. Yes, laughing is so great for regulating the nervous system. I have a practice, that I often do when I'm feeling like really stressed about money is I'll call a friend and I'll laugh about it because that helps me in the moment. And it's maybe a serious thing, but like bringing some lightness to it helps me actually bring my prefrontal cortex online. And then I can get to a place where I can actually make a decision that I need to make. When I teach traditional financial literacy, I make a lot of jokes. I do like a game show and I give away money and it's like fun. And I do that strategically because I know it'll help people be in more of a regulated nervous system. Mindfulness is a great way to access the window of resilience. And mindfulness, we can do this actually by bringing mindful awareness to what's happening. So this is where we ask the question, whose shame is this? That is an example of mindfulness. Cold water therapy. We know that cold water is really helpful for actually resetting our dopamine baseline. It's very helpful for activating the parasympathetic nervous system. So putting ice or like cold water on the back of the neck, putting it on your face, even just getting your wrists in cold water can really help the nervous system if you're feeling quite activated. Also, I can't see my screen here. Socializing, window of resilience, breathing. So you can just Google multiple types of breath practices for different things that you need. So if you're feeling collapsed and tired, you can Google more of an activating breath, or you can Google a breath that's more calming. There's so many different ones. For example, there's a breath that we like to use, which is where you block your right nostril and you breathe in through your left nostril. And they say that this is really good to activate the parasympathetic nervous system to get into calm. And they also say that it's good for compulsion. So if there's compulsive spending, this is a nice practice. Humming, singing, and chanting is so powerful for regulating the nervous system. One of the somatic therapists, Peter Levine, has an activity where he calls it vooing. So he hums voo. So if you just want to try that with me and notice how that feels, voo. And you'll feel the vibration, and this is very calming for the nervous system. Massaging yourself, an animal, another person. It helps us release oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, which is really great for bringing that nervous system into a regulated state. Physical activities of dancing, it's one of my favorites. Soothing your senses. So maybe we'll do a little nervous system activity right now, actually around soothing your senses. If it feels right for you, I invite you to close your eyes and inhale through the nose. Exhale through the mouth. And I invite you to notice 3 things that you hear. So you're going to have to do some layered listening here, and I'm going to mute myself. So 3 things that you hear. Beautiful. And now I invite you to notice 2 things that you feel on your body. So I'm talking more physically. Do you feel your clothes on you? Do you feel your chair underneath you? And noticing how that feels. Is it soft? Is it firm? Now I invite you, if it feels accessible, to breathe in through your nose and notice if you can smell anything. When it feels right for you, I invite you to slowly and softly open your eyes. And as you open your eyes, look around the room, moving your neck, orienting yourself in your space. And I invite you to notice 4 things that you see and name them to yourself and name the color of what you see. Beautiful. Wonderful. So this is a very powerful tool to use if we're feeling quite triggered. That can help bring us back into the body and help getting the nervous system regulated. Another way to access the window of resilience is probiotics and omega-3. So there's a lot of research around gut health and serotonin being produced in the gut, and serotonin helping us regulate our mood. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Stacey. Yeah. So another thing that's really interesting when we're in a trauma-triggered state, and I think this is important when you're having like meetings around your finances, is if we are feeling triggered, there's an area in our brain called the Broca's lobe, which is associated with speech production, facial neuron control, and language processing. This actually decreases this area. So if we're feeling triggered, it may be hard to comprehend what someone is saying or to articulate our thoughts. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in situations where I want to talk about money, or I want to talk about, something that's important to me, and I'm feeling triggered, maybe in a meeting, and I cannot say what I want to say clearly. Like it's in my head and I cannot get it out. And now, because I know this information, I know that this is an indicator that I need to regulate my nervous system and take some time for myself so I can get back into a regulated place. And I think this is really important through the lens of shame, because, you know, we may have been in this situation where we're trying to articulate something and we can't, and then we take on that shame like it's a reflection of our knowledge. And it's not. It's the fact that maybe we're in a trauma-triggered state. And if we know that collective trauma like capitalism can trigger us and create certain narratives around money, and these can arise often, like this tells us that this can happen. And it actually can be one of the reasons why we carry a lot of shame, like that say things like, I'm not good at money. I'm not smart enough at money. I don't have enough financial literacy. And it may have nothing to do with that, but the fact that your nervous system is unregulated every time you're trying to interact with money. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about scarcity, because on our research journey, we found some interesting things about scarcity. So, we found that scarcity is actually very similar to trauma. And the brain does not know the difference between you actually being in scarcity or you believing that you're in scarcity. Because scarcity can be so linked to, it can be very subjective in a way. And so, for example, let's say you're engaging with a lot of Instagram content and you're seeing all your friends doing something that you are not doing. Like maybe they're traveling and you're not doing that, and you start going into comparison mode, and you're essentially, this comparison creates a narrative of scarcity. Like they have that and I don't have that. The brain can react in a similar way as if you are experiencing extreme financial scarcity, for real. So scarcity is a really challenging thing that comes up and has impacts on the brain, like we see in trauma triggers. So prefrontal cortex goes offline. It impacts our fluid intelligence, how we process information, decision making, organization, and impulse control. And something that's a little bit scary about scarcity is that this is the definition of economics from the American Economic Association. Economics is the study of scarcity and the study of how people use resources and respond to incentives. So in our economic systems in North America, scarcity is built into it. The way we interact with money, the way we talk about money, it comes through the lens of scarcity. Yet scarcity actually has an impact on our brain and our body that really mirrors a trauma response. So what happens in a state of scarcity? One, we do something called tunneling. And tunneling is essentially, there's a tunnel and we get very narrow vision, just like trauma, very narrow vision. And we're really focused on whatever is scarce. So there's a focused dividend on whatever is scarce. And what this does is it results in inhibited goals. So if you're in a state of scarcity and you're working with a financial advisor and they say, let's work on your retirement planning, your brain cannot handle it because that's outside of the tunnel. All you can focus on is what's in the tunnel. If you're in financial scarcity and you've got credit card debt that you know is going to take you 4 years to pay off, it's going to be very challenging to stick to that goal of paying it off because it's too outside the tunnel. So the one thing that we do when we have financial scarcity is we create mini goals within the tunnel. And our first goals all have to be directed around putting out the fires of scarcity. And what this does is it creates more bandwidth for us. And the reason why is because the researchers talk about this concept called slack. And they use a suitcase example. So say we're packing for a trip and we have a big suitcase. We're like, am I going to go for a run? I don't know. I'll throw the runners in it and I don't even think about it. I just throw it in and I go on with my day. And packing is just packing. That's it. But when you have a tiny suitcase, you start doing things like trade-off thinking. Well, if I bring the runners, I can't bring the hair straightener. And is it better to straighten my hair or have my runners? Do I actually have time to run? So the whole process of packing becomes pretty big and takes up a lot of mental capacity. And when you zip that suitcase up, you're not done. Like you walk away and you're still thinking about this. That's what scarcity does to the brain. It's like having a bunch of tabs open on your computer and the whole computer slows down. That's bandwidth tax. That's scarcity. Scarcity continues to run in the background, slowing down the entire operating system. And now when we have a tax bandwidth, what ends up happening is we experience another tax called temptation tax. And this is where we're more likely to act out on a temptation when we're in scarcity because we're in pain and we want to soothe pain. So they did some research and they found that folks living in poverty would, they saw like 10% higher would spend on temptations versus someone who wasn't living in poverty. And so this is why, if you've experienced financial scarcity, you go out and you'll spend $45 on Uber Eats for just yourself when you're having financial scarcity. Or you'll go and buy like a pair of shoes when, you're worried about the rent. And it's because of temptation tax. We are more likely, the brain is feeling overwhelmed. The brain wants to seek some dopamine because dopamine helps us feel motivated. It creates a sense of pleasure. We're going to act out on the temptation. Yeah, I know. I'm called out too. I'm feeling seen as well. When I first found this research, I was like, holy shit. Like this explains so much. And it also tells us how, like from a policy standpoint and from like interacting with poverty, that they're so way off. They're so way off. Like bringing out more financial literacy education programs is going to do nothing when people are in scarcity. So the researchers, and these two researchers here are the ones who wrote this book called Scarcity, where a lot of this research is pulled from. They say being poor, for example, reduces a person's cognitive capacity more than going one full nights without sleep. So it's not that the poor have less bandwidth as individuals, rather it is the experience of poverty reduces anyone's bandwidth. So what the researchers did is they tested scarcity on folks who have a lot of resources. And they tested things like, because we can have financial scarcity, we can have food scarcity, we could have time scarcity, we can have affection scarcity. And they found that regardless of who it is, regardless of their IQ, their, the amount of like work effort they have, regardless of that, if they're in a state of scarcity, their brain gets impacted the same way. And this is really important information because we shame people in financial scarcity a lot in our society. So they say people in scarcity must make higher quality decisions. So going back to the suitcase analogy, packing problems are harder under scarcity, more temptations under scarcity. And because you have scarcity, you actually can't afford to make mistakes. So if you have financial scarcity and, you make a mistake with your bookkeeping, it's more severe for you than someone who doesn't. Yet you have less access to your cognitive capacity because of scarcity and what it does to the brain. So, people who are in scarcity are in a worse position to make quality decisions because they're distracted by trade-off thinking and bandwidth tax. They're depleted by challenges, temptations. They're hampered by context, stereotypes, past failures, a lot of shame, and we don't recognize scarcity's challenges. So what do we do in this situation? Well, speaking at a macro level and a micro level. So from a policy standpoint and from an individual standpoint, we work on bandwidth sensitivity policies. So how can we create slack? How can we create more bandwidth? And also, how can we invite fault tolerance? And that was the word I used earlier when I was talking about things being in a constant state of refinement. Fault tolerance. Yes. So, one thing that happens when we're in trauma or scarcity is we tunnel, we get narrow vision. So I invite you all to join me to expand our vision if that is accessible to you, by just looking around the room, expanding out the vision and orienting yourself maybe in your space. If you have a window, look outside, go into a more landscaped view. Yeah, beautiful. Okay. I'd love to just take a moment to share, do some sharing. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Something that has come up a few times during this is my dad is a gambling addict. And so it really impacted my childhood and my parents' marriage. And my brother and I have been impacted by his addiction greatly. And it's fascinating because when I dig into this work in a deeper way, specifically in that trauma response, so much of those feelings from childhood come up of wanting to run away. That like real flee is so, or like flight is so present, and being able to like use my eyes right now to expand the vision. I hold my trauma in my hips and my lower body, which is what really, I think, activates that desire to run. And so using my eyes to ground myself in the space and expand the like abundance of my environment feels so counterintuitive. And it is like immediately my entire like process just like slows and settles. So this has been so helpful. I really appreciate it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Stacey. There's so much wisdom in your share of the body and how the nervous system is feeling. So thank you for showing that to all of us, because it's really beautiful. And that mindful awareness of what's happening in the body and linking it to the narrative is very, very helpful in this healing process. Caroline.
Yeah, it's the conversation around scarcity and like how that impacts decision making feels so like liberating and nourishing, because I think back to a lot of the narratives that I picked up from my childhood about like my dad would put wealth on a pedestal and wealthy people on a pedestal, and always feeling like, oh, no matter where you are or we are as a family, like there's always better, and there's always, and those people are somehow better who are farther ahead in whatever capacity. And it feels so nourishing for like, you know, the body and the nervous system to be like, whoa, no, it's a universal human experience to respond to scarcity in whatever way we respond to scarcity. So it just feels really, feels like a shame eraser. So thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for saying that. I feel you. Okay. Michelle.
Hi, Chantel. I was wondering if there is a correlation with addiction
and finding ourselves in the same situation, because I was analyzing, thanks to all the information that you're giving us, how I always put myself in the same situation in regards money. It feels like as soon as I get into a position where I'm earning enough, that that it serves me for paying everything and have a little bit more and have fun. And then suddenly I just decide or to quit my job or to in back to a square zero where I feel very anxious about money. And like thankfully I've never had any I have always found my way around, but it's been like more than 4 times that I find myself in the same situation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, for pointing that out and bringing up addiction, because I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. And it was actually through addiction and recovery that the trauma of money was really where it came from. I grew up with a father figure who was a heroin addict, and then my brother went down the same path, and my brother reached out to me. He was living on the downtown east side in Vancouver, and he's like, I'm at a detox center, and I was shocked. I didn't even know he was using. And I picked him up, and I threw myself into my brother's addiction recovery. And I'm like, I'm going to save you. And through that, me trying to save him through his recovery, I realized I started going to Al-Anon, which is a recovery program for folks who have family members or partners who are also in active addiction. And through that experience, I realized that so many of the things I was doing in my life around money were in the realm of addiction, except for the things that I was doing, society actually sometimes celebrated them, and they were more acceptable versus my brother's addiction of choice, which was not accepted, being the substance abuse. And so I realized that my patterns of addiction were people pleasing, so codependency, and it showed up through workaholism and through my overspending. All my overspending was codependent, even just like buying a certain look or whatever to like be accepted, right? And I just like the workaholism, the codependency, the overspending, all of this were showing up for me in addictive ways, but society was saying, no, this stuff is actually good and this is okay. And that was really what put me on this path of doing the research around trauma of money. And yeah, Alexandra shared the ACA, Adult Child of Alcoholic Dysfunctional Family Characteristics. This laundry list that was shared here is amazing. And really, it was really helpful for me in my recovery journey. And on that note, I'm going to go back to my screen and we're going to talk a little bit about money disorders and addictions. And someone in the chat mentioned Dr. Gabor Mate, and Dr. Gabor Mate, he defines addiction as when we do something over and over again to temporarily reduce pain, and increase pleasure, even though it has negative consequences. So this is essentially a pattern of a behavior that is happening, and we do it to give ourselves pleasure or to just stop pain or to distract. But there are some negative consequences. He also says that addiction is the secondary problem that comes out of a primary problem. So when we put all the emphasis on the secondary problem, but we ignore the primary, how do we succeed? And I love to show this when I talk about money disorders, because I see money disorders in the same way as addiction. So overspending, whatever the behavior is, it's a pattern and it has negative consequences. Now, I'm also very careful when we talk about money disorders, because I'm really uncomfortable with an outside person or like an institution saying your behavior this way around money is a disorder. Because I think when it comes to money, we need to define our own relationship with money. And we are the wisest ones to identify whether this is a disorder or not. So we have to be a little bit careful here, because that would be a very colonial approach to financial disorders, which we're trying to avoid when we really work through increasing our discernment around our behavior with money. These two guys, Brad and Ted Clons, these are the financial psychologists in the US who talk a lot about money disorders. And if you're curious, they've got a quiz online where you can figure out your financial disorders through their quiz. These quizzes are limited, and they only take into point some data points, but it is a bit fascinating. Just take it a little bit with a grain of salt. So in the mental health industry, there's a book, and for any therapists in the room, they'll know this book. It's called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is basically the manual that health professionals use to diagnose a disorder. What's very interesting is there's like 11 main financial disorders that we work with in the finance world, and only 2 of them are in this, and that is gambling and hoarding. And that's a little concerning to me because it's just showing that the psychology industry is not fully up to speed around some of the patterns that are happening with money that are causing a lot of pain for folks. For example, compulsive spending is just as common in the US as anxiety and depression. Yet it's not identified as a disorder through the lens of psychology. So the Clonses, they categorize their money disorders into 3 different categories. There's money avoidance disorders, money worshiping disorders, and relational money disorders. So I'm going to quickly go through some of these just so you can see some of them, but I'm going to focus on 2 based on what I was seeing in our mural board with some of the narratives. So financial denial is essentially, if we're looking at the lens of the nervous system, this is freeze or collapse. This is avoidance. At its most extreme state, it's like a dissociation and a collapse. Our defense mechanism, disassociation, minimize, ignore, avoid finances, not looking at statements, not updating pricing, not negotiating raises, not negotiating payment terms. And this is just avoid. Financial rejection. So this is where we feel unworthy of money, either consciously or subconsciously. And we basically consciously or subconsciously reject wealth. So this was a big one for me. Growing up in poverty, I grew up with this narrative a lot. Rich people are greedy. Rich people are assholes. And I also learned that...
I think it's recorded.
I also learned that in order to feel safe, I needed to have money. That was a narrative that I learned. But because I had this very strong financial rejection subconscious narrative, every time I got money, I would overspend it. So it was like this subconscious rejection of money. There's another term that the Clonses use called financial comfort zone. And this is where they say, like, if we grew up in poverty, our financial comfort zone may be scarcity or maybe poverty. They say we could take essentially a subconscious vow of poverty. And I have a picture of bologna here because it reminds me of like growing up and not having a lot of access to money. We would eat bologna and like Wonder Bread all the time. And whenever I get upset or stressed, I'll eat things like this. Like I'll eat Kraft dinner and like all these things. And it reminds me of my financial comfort zone, like this desire to be in the place that I grew up with, even though it is actually uncomfortable. When I eat this, I feel uncomfortable. It hurts my stomach. There are repercussions, but on a nervous system level and a subconscious level, there's some comfort there. And it's really fascinating, this financial comfort zone, when we link it to that societal trauma piece, because all of us living in exploitive capitalism and this, dominant culture and colonization, if we carry a level of empathy, we're going to carry shame and we're going to carry guilt around having money. And guilt is really interesting to explore because it actually can be one of our interventions for breaking the financial comfort zone, or for, working through an aversion to capitalism. So guilt and agitation-based emotion that is aroused when the actor usually causes or anticipates causing or is associated with an aversive event. But they found that personal guilt can actually motivate repair attempts, can result in apologies, reparations, and accountability. And collective guilt can motivate acts of compensation in terms of monetary and policy support. Well, this is amazing news. And I'm sharing this with you because I'm telling you that if you feel any guilt or any shame of having wealth, this is an indicator that you can be trusted with money, because there's something there within you that wants to change the way things were done through the lens of exploitive capitalism. So take the shame, take the guilt, and use it as a reminder that you actually can go create wealth and you can do something different and you can do good with it. So there's a term called existential guilt, which says that if one's in-group has an illegitimate advantage, the individual will likely experience guilt without having direct responsibility for the illegitimate acts against the outside group. So this is just a reminder that most of us carry some guilt and trauma around capitalism and exploitive capitalism that will directly impact how we interact with money and impact our earning abilities. It can result in what we call financial rejection. So subconscious denial of having wealth. Let's see here. Another example of a money disorder is underspending. So, being afraid to buy anything, being afraid to spend any money because you're carrying a lot of scarcity and you do not want to take any risks. And you're probably like, why is Chantel with Shaquille O'Neal and a very bad makeup job? Let me tell you. So I did this. I was on this red carpet event for the NBA All-Star game, maybe 4 years ago. And I was interviewing the celebrities, asking them if you could go back and tell yourself one piece of advice around money, what would that be? And I interviewed Shaquille O'Neal, and he's like, save 75% of your income. And I'm like, 75% of your income? What? What do you mean? And this is really interesting advice, because if I saw someone trying to save 75% of their income as a rule for themselves, we may categorize this as a financial disorder of underspending, right? There's a grasping and a fear and not wanting to engage with the present moment and spending or living your life out of fear. But for Shaquille O'Neal, when he is at that level of wealth, he can still live a pretty good life, only spending 25% of his income, right? So it's very relative. And then the next category they call money worshiping disorders. So hoarding, which is in the DSM-5. Hoarding is emotionally being attached to possessions. We can also hoard money, gambling and unreasonable risk-taking. Gambling is in the DSM-5. Workaholism, And it's so interesting though, because they call this a money worshiping disorder, but I told you when I experienced workaholism, for me, it was more of a relational money disorder. It was more codependent. I wasn't working because I was worshiping money. I was working because I was like people pleasing as a trauma response. Compulsive buying disorder or overspending. And then relational money disorders. So we have financial infidelity, financial incest, which feels like a very heavy word for what this is. And essentially it's where there's psychological abuse between the caretaker and a child usually. So an example of this would be the parent, oversharing their financial burdens with a child who's not emotionally mature to understand it. And, or this happens a lot, like with divorced parents, where one of the parents might use money in an unhealthy way to show love and create conflict between parents. Financial dependence, Klon says is a money disorder. I would really take this one on an individual basis because there are certain situations where someone is financially dependent, but there's a different form of reciprocity, and I would not categorize that as a financial disorder. I would say financial dependence can be a disorder when there's severe negative consequences on the person being dependent that impacts their sense of self. And then the last one is financial enabling. And the financial enabling was the one that I connected to a lot with my codependency and my people pleasing as a trauma response. So financial enablers often put themselves at financial risk in order to help others. They have trouble saying no, and may avoid making clear arrangements in contracts, repayments of loans. They often feel taken advantage of by others and may feel resentment or anger after giving money. This is the one that I deeply relate to, the people pleasing, as I mentioned, and the codependency. And for me, my financial enabling actually was the umbrella for other financial disorders. So when I was people pleasing all the time, I was freaking exhausted. So what fell to the wayside was my budgeting, was my accounting, was my bookkeeping. So I essentially was going into financial avoidance because I was people pleasing and my shit just fell to the wayside. Unreasonable risk taking. So someone says, hey, buy in on this deal. It's really great. And you're being a people pleaser. So you say yes, and you are then taking an unreasonable risk. Workaholism, financial rejection, and overspending can all be linked to this.
Chantel,
yeah.
Can you define financial infidelity for us really quickly?
Yeah, financial infidelity is when you are in a, they categorize it as typically a romantic relationship or a partnership, where one of the partners is not disclosing elements of their finances to the other partner or making decisions with their money and not telling them. So financial cheating, essentially. When I was a mortgage broker, I saw this all the time. So I would have to do a credit check on a couple. They're sitting in the room and we would go through their debts, and one person might have a credit card that the spouse didn't know about. Like, that's what they would categorize as financial infidelity. I'm quite careful with this when I'm teaching in trauma of money, because I personally believe that it is the partnership and the relationship that should define the boundaries around money. You may have in your partnership that the partner can, have cards and not tell the other person, and that's okay if that's defined. And it's mostly about having that clear conversation about what you want your financial boundaries to be versus this is the right way for couples to run their money and this is the wrong way. But they say anything that is like behind the curtains and you're hiding it from your partner, that's considered financial infidelity. So that's a lot of information, and it's actually just kind of the tip of some of the stuff that we work through. But I wanted to give you some foundational stuff. And just going back to our approach, I think is really important here is, where's that slide? Is remembering this is, nervous system always first, finding ways to really like support and nourish the nervous system. And I would love to just take maybe 3 minutes to do a nervous system exercise with you all, which is one of my favorites. And then after that, we'll have some questions. So this exercise is called ipsilateral contralateral. And what we're going to do is we're going to work on bilateral stimulation. So we're going to work on stimulating both sides of the brain. And if any of you have ever experienced EMDR therapy, so eye movement eye movement desensitization reprocessing, that's what they're doing here. Is they're stimulating both sides of the brain. So that's what we're going to do in this activity. And let me get some music, because music is really helpful here. Now, if this is accessible to you, I invite you to stand up, and we're going to move our body. If it's not accessible to you, you can stay seated, and you can modify this in any way you want. So ipso basically means same side of the body, and contralateral means opposite sides of the body. So I have this sign here, and when you see ipso on the screen, you're going to move like this. Same side of the body. Okay? And when you see contra, you're going to do opposite side of the body. And you can do that movement however you want. Like you can walk, and you can be like walking same side and opposite. You can do however you want. And let me get some music here. Okay. Share music. Okay, now just dance however you want. feels so good to move the body. Oh. Amazing. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me in that movement. I love it. All right, friends. So we are at our completion, but I would like to stick around and ask any questions or answer any questions that you may have. And I have one favor of you. If you could go into our mural board and write down a helpful money narrative that you would like to leave with, and maybe one that you would like to share with the group as well, that might be helpful for them. And let's fill this board up, and I'll send it out so you all have it as a reference too. Yeah, beautiful. I can be trusted with money. Money gives me opportunity. Money finds its way to me. If the world is money, then I need to make lots to help save the world. Yes. Yeah. I'm worthy of being resourced. I love that. Any questions that anyone has while we're working on our helpful money narratives, please feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Now that we know about all of this, what would you say is a good first step? What's the best next step?
I would say, it's dependent on your healing, where you're at on your healing journey. But I always say step one is nervous system, and finding ways to really nourish your nervous system when these feelings arise. And one thing I want to share with you is I've been doing this work for many years, and I still have moments where I'll go into scarcity. You know, Homo sapiens have been around for 70,000 years, and part of going into scarcity is activating that survival part of our brain. And that's so biologically imprinted in us that the goal is not to get rid of those scarcity thoughts, because it's going to be so hard to do that. The goal is to find resources and tools to use when they arise. And I notice that scarcity narrative or those thoughts come up less, but when they come up, I know how to meet them. And I meet them with my nervous system nourishment. And that's really, really helpful. That's been very helpful for me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just going to say a collective thank you that I know everyone is putting in the chat and is feeling right now. Also, dance party, the exact thing that I needed in the middle of the day at 2:00. That was amazing. And what a way to regulate the nervous system. So thank you so much for your wisdom, for sharing just all of the resources that you have. It's clear that you are truly an expert in this field. And I feel really honored to have had you come words and speak to us and share that wisdom with us. If no one else has any questions, I would like to say I highly recommend that you all head over to Trauma of Money. And Chantel is doing a workshop in March, actually, that I think is going to be incredible. I'm already signed up for it. I cannot wait. I'm really excited. And I think there's an early bird special happening right now as well, until the end of the month. So now is the time. And yeah, I'm just so grateful. This was wonderful. And I learned so much, so many things, so many aha moments, and so many things that were solidified and confirmed, for me. And it really helped me put things into perspective, and take a lot of the pressure off. So incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Janelle. And I'm so grateful to be in this community. It's such a beautiful community. So thank you so much for having me in this space. I'm going to send out a couple things afterwards. I'm going to leave up this mural board for the day. So if you want time to go in and write on the right-hand side, I'm going to send this out tomorrow. I'll send out my slides if they're useful. And I'm also going to send out an intervention that's originally from Dr. Brad and Ted Klons, but we've modified it a bit. That's called Identifying My Spender. So it's an exercise to help us work through what's arising when we're in that spending mode. And it's a very cool reflection exercise. So I'll send that all out to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody. Thank you to everybody for coming. I definitely want to talk about this in the hub. So like, look out for some prompts, because I'm so curious what everybody's experience is after this workshop and how things kind of feel out in the world when you actually have money in your hand, and what if your relationship has shifted at all, or if you just have become more conscious and aware. So thank you. We'll see you in the community, and look out for all the things that Chantel is sending our way.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.